Hi, welcome to MBAX 9152 Digital Strategy. This is your week 2 introduction. The title of this week's content is Innovating with Digital Technologies. My name is David Goad and I'm your course coordinator for MBAX 9152. The agenda for today's presentation is very short. It's basically I'm going to review the content for this week coming up and the key concepts. And I'm going to review your to-dos for this week, upcoming week 2, in terms of various tasks and activities that you need to complete coming forward for next week. So the text talks about a number of different stages or different concepts with regards to digital innovation and how you innovate in an organization. The first thing it talks about, this is concept of the innovation process, the idea that most organizations go through a fairly standard process of firstly generating ideas, then trying to circulate those ideas and getting awareness from a management perspective, doing some sort of process with regards to evaluating those ideas, which might include, is it important for the business? Is it strategic? Do we have the right technologies? Can we do this technically? And, really at the end of the day, can we afford this particular innovation or idea and the technology associated with it? Other things that may be considered are things like, whether it's compatible with suppliers, technology and tool sets. And then once we've picked the ideas that we want to go with, then we will go through some form of process of implementation, assimilating those into the trying to get some business case or benefits out of it. In terms of types of innovation, the text talks about this idea of open innovation versus closed innovation. This is the idea that some organizations culturally believe that innovation is something that's packaged up and owned by one particular group in the organization, that it's a structured process and that it needs to be managed in a structured way. Then you have other cultural, or from a cultural perspective, other organizations that have this idea that innovation is an open process where anyone can participate. They encourage collaboration and innovation. This typically means that customers and partners are also invited to participate in the innovation process as well. Clearly, the closed innovation is probably more traditional. Organizations these days, or at least the more progressive ones, are moving to more of an open innovation concept. There is always a challenge with regards to innovating, and that is that many organizations get too focused on addressing current customer needs without actually looking into the future and looking at either unstated or future customer needs. There's also a natural contradiction with public companies and in terms of their drive for profitability versus supporting innovation. If you're a public company where your stock price is a function of price to earnings ratio, and so therefore as a CEO or senior executive, you're trying to increase your earnings to therefore increase your stock price and therefore increase the value of the stock options that you might own as a senior executive, then you're really focused on short-term profitability. Most innovative technologies and innovations do not generate profits in the short term. You have to have more of a long-term focus. So there's this natural contradiction between focusing on innovation and developing the organization and focusing on the long term versus driving the short-term earnings in order to drive stock price up, in order to drive remuneration for the senior executives. So this is a constant challenge with most organizations, particularly publicly listed companies. Then there's a concept that we talk about, which is disruptive innovation. This is the idea that innovation will create a completely new market or ecosystem. And there's been several examples of that over the last 15 to 20 years of the internet. And now some more examples with regards to the Internet of Things. And then they talk about this idea of sustaining innovation, where that's actually developing existing products and services and improving costs, improving the service levels that you're providing for those existing products. There's a number of different factors that affect innovation in an organization that are talked about in the text and in the readings. They talk about this idea of technology push versus business pull influences. I actually talked about this concept last week indirectly when I talked about digital optimization versus digital transformation. It's the whole idea that the organization comes along and says, is it the organization or the business that's driving the need for the technology, or is it a new technology coming along and solving old problems or creating new opportunities and applying that new technology? Organizations will be limited in terms of their capabilities and constraints. Do they actually have the money to invest in that? Do they have the organizational capacity? These are often challenges. In my consulting role that I do now for various organizations, one of the challenges I found is that when you're going in with new disruptive technologies, particularly in business units that are actually struggling from a performance perspective, they'll often tell you that they simply don't have the time to fix their own problems. And that creates a management challenge, because if you don't have the time to fix your own problems, then how are you ever going to get better? So there's a cultural issue there in terms of, how do you prioritize workloads and how are you going to make investments. There's also issues with regards to the firm context and the culture. Do you have a culture, like I said, is it open innovation? Is it closed innovation? Do they promote innovation? Are they willing to make the investments necessary to be an innovative workplace? Many organizations are not capable of doing that. And in some contexts, if it's a down industry or it's highly competitive or there's other issues going on, then they just simply might not be in a position to do so. So again, as I said, if you relate this back to the Gartner document that I showed you last week, or that Gartner strategy where they talk about this issue of digital business optimization and digital business transformation, on the left-hand side, you got the organization of the business driving the requirements, and they're trying to improve existing processes and existing systems. Digital business transformation, which they might, so the first one you might consider to be a pole in the case of digital business transformation. This might be this idea of a push where new technologies are pushing new business models, new ways of doing things, and new revenue and products and services onto the organization. So pull versus push, digital business optimization versus digital business transformation. They are very similar concepts. Now, the other thing that the book talks about is this issue of legitimacy of the technologies being used. And I actually did a research paper on this last year, so some of the content I'm putting into this is from my research paper. And the research was around how do these new technologies, particularly these disruptive ones, achieve legitimacy within an organization. And it's really an interesting process that most organizations and culturally most societies go through. In order to really talk about this issue of technology legitimacy, though, you have to go through a few foundational concepts. So what is legitimacy? It's a commonly understood or general perception or assumption that actions of an entity, could be a person or an organization, are proper or appropriate and fall within the norms and values. There's been a lot of theory developed around legitimacy and corporate performance and how corporations act in society. Legitimacy theory talks about the expectation sets of various bodies on the corporate person and on people themselves. So, the expectations that people have on you in terms of your own personal performance, how you act, how you think, the things that you say. There are social norms that are implied in most cultures and most organizations, that they influence how people think about things. And really, there's this ongoing challenge between how do you either evolve those expectation sets or those cultural norms, or the organization matches those cultural norms. For example, if there's an expectation from a societal perspective that an organization needs to be more innovative, then how do they match that innovation imperative? And there's really only two ways to do this. Either the organization needs to change their own practices, or they need to change the culture and beliefs of the society or the people that are influencing those. And in some cases, for example, specifically with regards to governments, of organizations or companies are not doing the right thing, then you may see governments take action. For example, the General Data Protection Regulation released by the EU last year, which basically manages not only data protection, but also the use of artificial intelligence and other technologies in business. So this leads to a really interesting sort of process of how do new technologies become legitimate within an organization. And it's interesting because there's actually, you can take legitimacy and break it down into sort of several different types of legitimacy. There's what they refer to as pragmatic legitimacy, which this is basically where an organization, does the technology provide value to an organization's interested constituents, for example, its customers, stakeholders, and employees. So this is an organization just being pragmatic. When they say pragmatic, they mean, developing new technologies or tools that are going to basically make customers and employees better. So if it's going to do that and people accept that, then it becomes, legitimate from a pragmatic perspective. Then there's this issue of what they refer to as moral legitimacy, which is, what they refer to as a positive normative evaluation of organizational practices by external stakeholders. That means, are you treating your employees the correct way? Are you acting, from an environmental perspective the correct way? This is what they refer to as moral legitimacy. Then the third type of legitimacy, which I find the most interesting one, is what they refer to as cognitive legitimacy, which there's a detailed definition there, but it's basically the taking for grantedness by society. For example, one could argue that mobile phones have achieved cognitive legitimacy because everyone sees them everywhere, and so they just take them for granted. Things like Facebook and Twitter, people just take that for granted. The lack of privacy that people have on these social networking tools, they just take that for granted because, these technologies have achieved cognitive legitimacy, in society. So what is the technological legitimation process? How do these technologies, these new disruptive technologies, achieve legitimacy within an organization and widespread use? Usually involves a fairly well-defined several-step process. First, someone in the organization uses the technology in a specific area that might justify the use of that technology off the back of some other project that's going on, and they kind of fold it or hide it into existing project, right? The technology starts getting used, and then people start seeing it being used, right? And it doesn't get challenged. Then what happens is that technology gets spread out to similar use cases or contexts or applications across the organization, and it starts becoming more and more common, right? And then what happens is it achieves what they refer to as general validation, where over the course of time, because more and more people see the technology being used, they just assume that, it's okay, and then it's just taken for granted, and it achieves this, what I would refer to as cognitive legitimacy that, people would seek in technologies. So an interesting use case or study with regards to radical technologies is in the UK and what they refer to as indirect potable resource reuse of water. So about 10 or 15 years ago, someone came up with a technology in the UK to basically take wastewater, properly treat that, and then return it as fresh water back into all the inbound water pipes for all the houses and all the communities in the UK. Obviously, when this technology first came out, people were not particularly interested in using wastewater or drinking wastewater, even though it might have been treated in very clean and purified wastewater. They weren't interested in doing that, even though it's probably better for the environment. Eventually, what happened was that they broadened this technology out. They started using this technology in a few cities in the UK, and because more and more cities were using it, more and more people got used to the fact that they were using this IPR technology to generate water for the various cities, and became more and more popular. And now, what you find in the UK is there's quite a few cities that actually have this IPR potable water technology. It achieved cognitive legitimacy in that process. It's an interesting case study, and you can go back and study, and there's lots of information on the internet about that. When developing technologies, one of the first questions that people talk about is, are we going to do exploration versus exploitation? So are we going to use information systems and technology to try and generate new knowledge and new information and new tool sets about our customers? Are we going to try and exploit existing technologies to simply improve optimization, transaction costs? Again, these are concepts that are synonymous with digital optimization versus digital transformation, push versus pull of technology. It's sort of the two sides of the equation in terms of the innovation process. Innovation can be driven both ways, the business driving it, the technology driving it. It can be driven based on people trying to see new opportunities versus people trying to exploit existing processes. And so there's a trade-off back and forth, and people trying to see where they can develop new business models and new. The DICAR model that they talk about, this idea of data versus information versus knowledge versus actions. So this is this whole idea of using information, either using information technology or IIs to generate more information, data, and knowledge, or to use it to make knowledge more actionable. There is a very well-defined difference in terms of definition between data versus information versus knowledge. The example that I always use in my courses is, if I give you the number 32, that's a piece of data. If I say it's 32 degrees Celsius, then you go, that gives you some information. Actually, you understand that's actually representing temperature. If I say that the temperature today outside is 32 degrees Celsius, then that actually gives you knowledge about your surrounding environment. Those differences are important because many organizations these days will say that they are data rich, but information and knowledge poor. In other words, they have lots of raw data coming into, through their data warehouses and through other various sources, through the Internet of Things now, and that they're actually not getting any real information out of that or developing any true knowledge about their competitive environment, about their organization and how it operates, right? So you really need to have knowledge before you can start doing any form of, really valid decision making. So a lot of the question for organizations when developing new technologies, information systems, information technologies, and trying to develop innovation is, are they going to try and get more information in, or are they going to try to use that, or are they going to try to get more data in, or are they going to try to convert that data to information and knowledge so they can do better decision making? And so that's promoted these days, this new concept that what they refer to as a citizens data scientist. Data science as a job function is becoming more and more important these days, not only because it's the data scientists that are deploying technologies like artificial intelligence, but they're also the ones that are helping to drive knowledge out of the existing data they have. One of the new phenomenons that's been coming out in industry over the last few years is this concept of the citizen data scientist, or the idea that you're going to build technologies which enable everyday managers and people in the organization to empower themselves to get more knowledge out of the information and data that they have themselves without needing a data scientist. So this is kind of an interesting phenomenon in a discussion in terms of the technologies and that, and people are using these technologies to enable. One of the things, the other thing that they talked about in the text was this idea of exploring data. One of my favorite quotes, for those of you who are historians, particularly around American military history, a number of years ago when the U.S. invaded Iraq. And by the way, I should point out I'm actually not American, I'm actually Canadian, just for everyone's reference. But there was this character called Donald Rumsfeld who was quite famous. He was actually in a couple of movies, or his character was in a couple of movies. He had a long political career, but his last role in the United States government was as their U.S. Secretary of Defense. And he had this very famous quote where he talked about the concept of, and this is the quote, there are known knowns, there are the things we know, there are the known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know, but then there are also the unknown unknowns. These are the things that we don't know that we don't know. And when that came out in the news, because he was actually doing a briefing to the journalists around what was going on in the Iraq War, there was a bit of a joke going on around that. But that term, these known unknowns, was actually very well known in the military, and it was part of military policy and strategy, because what they were trying to do is identify all the different issues that they had to deal with when on the battlefield. You can actually apply this concept to data management when you talk about this idea that you actually understand the data. You either have the data and you know what you're looking for, or it's you know that you have the data, or are there known unknowns of things we don't know, and you're trying to assess new data. Do you actually understand the question? Have you defined the question, or is the question undefined? And you get scenarios where organizations have lots of data and they know there's value in the data, but they haven't defined the questions yet, or they have defined the questions and they know they have the data and they come up with some really useful dashboards and reports, or they know what the questions are, but they haven't had the data yet, and so they're going out and building process and systems to collect the data, or they don't know what data they need and they don't know what questions they're going to ask, but they know that there's going to be value in that, so they're just collecting lots of information anyways. For example, Google is an example of that. They just go out and collect heaps of information without actually knowing how they're going to use it or what value it's generating, just because they know overall it's going to generate some value. Anyways, that was sort of a brief review of the concepts covered in the readings this week. There was also a bunch of discussion around various technologies like artificial intelligence and that. I won't go into that. I actually do have a series of videos that I post up on my LinkedIn around various technologies like AI and blockchain and that kind of thing. So if you're interested, you can go and have a look at those on my LinkedIn. Or if you want, you can ask me about specific ones. I can post those, but I chose not to do that and just focus on the core concepts. In terms of your to-dos this week, the things that you need to focus on are, of course, the complete the core readings. You have a series of different core readings that you need to do. There is a discussion topic that you will have to do this week, and the discussion topic is around, is Uber a disruptor? Remember, and there was a question about it this week in the Q&A forum. What I'm expecting is that you will do one original post or state your essentially position around that topic, and then you'll go and read other people's positions and respond to their positions. If there's then further questions, you'll answer their questions. But I want to see a discussion. I want to see you take a position, and I want to see you have a discussion with other people in the class and discuss their positions and come to some sort of conclusions around that. And then you will have to write your first blog post in the week 2 coming up, and that blog post will be about the digital business innovation process. And if you read the specification in the course outline, you're supposed to talk about where you've seen an innovation process in one of the organizations you've worked at, and what does that looks like. All right, so you have a few to-dos this week in terms of your activities. The other thing I would suggest you do is start to talk to people about forming groups for your group projects. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them to me up on the Q&A forum in Moodle. You can also send me an email, but I would prefer that if you're going to email me a question, it should be more of a personal nature question, like, around your marks or something like that. If it's a question that people would generally be interested in, and other people might have that same question, then I prefer for you to put it up in Q&A form so that I can do a bit of a one-to-many where everyone can see my answer to it. The other thing, as I said, is I've identified that I'm going to do the fortnightly Q&A sessions. So the first one will be next Thursday at 9 p.m. They will be running fortnightly. I will send you a reminder out as well when it comes up next week. Not this Thursday. This Thursday I'm doing a Q&A forum for another class, but next Thursday is the Q&A forum for the digital strategy course. So anyways, I hope everyone has a good week and they're enjoying the course so far, and we'll talk to you soon.